Thank you, Rihanna, from our side. I'm very honored to be here as a visiting of the International or the IES, and especially very happy to co-present with Maria a paper that actually was written years ago and was completely different for a conference that was held in Loughborough in 2017. So it's a kind of cycle. We're closing a kind of cycle. We were there at that time. Our paper is completely different. Let me share the screen in the meanwhile. Our paper is completely different, a different topic, but I think we have some connections among the two. So as you can see here, I hope you can read it. The title is Media is Timekeepers, History and Categorization of Time Signals. So we are dealing with time signals. More in general, our paper is in the field of media studies, especially media history, let's say, but also in the history of technology. But let me do a step back before, because we would like to address some issues or what we call here relevant aspects of our paper in the relation between media and time, because there are several relations and we decide to focus on some of them. First of all, it's clear how media have changed the perception of time. And it's clear how there are different studies, researches on this topic, and it's beyond the scope of this paper to have a kind of systematic overview. But for sure, in the last decades, the word mediatization, and especially mediatization of time in this case, was relevant. So the fact that the media have changed what we perceive as a time. We will go back on this point later. Specifically, we will focus on the fact that media seem to favor time-space compression, especially acceleration. We are discussing a lot about acceleration today, to have introduced a kind of cultural speed, and so this influences contemporary societies, and also we all feel a kind of pressure of being scarce in time. So time scarcity is another keyword here. A third keyword for our paper is what John Thompson said. We are in the mid-1990s, and he called despatialized simultaneity. And I quote from John Thompson as well. Media and telecommunication held to experience events, and I quote, as simultaneous despite the fact that they occur in locales that were spatially remote. So the concept and the idea of despatialized simultaneity will return in our paper. A fourth, relevant aspect for our paper is the fact that media seem to influence the rhythm of everyday life. Media are relevant in creating new rhythms. They structure the everyday experience of everyone. And here we refer especially to a concept which was introduced by John Durham Peters. The concept is that of logistical media. And Peters famously said that, for example, calendars and clocks deeply structure human life. At the same time, we will argue time signals structure human life. Finally, we will deal with liveness, and media, and especially broadcasting, has been seen and perceived in the last decades as a powerful machine of liveness. When we say liveness, we do not just refer to live programs, but we refer especially to what John Ellis said, and now I quote again, on the fact that TV programs adopt the rhetoric of liveness. He said, "They talk of now and today, here and we. They use the present tense, which maintain the illusion of liveness." So those are some of the aspects that we'll address in our paper. But of course, one of the most important questions here is why to write a paper on the history of time signals. We think that time signals are super relevant for media studies, media history, but also history of technology, despite the fact that they are generally unnoticed. Here you can find a definition of time signals in 2010 and 2019, Oxford English Dictionary. As you can see in the first one, we have a relation with audio signals, of course indicating the exact time, especially in broadcast and especially by radio. In 2019, so 9 years later, the definition changed a little bit, always audible, but also visible and electronic signal serving to indicate again the exact time of the day. This means that not only in the last 10 years, but much before, we will argue, time signals have gone through a deep change. Why to study the time signals? I already mentioned the fact that they are part of the everyday life experience and everyday human needs. Unfortunately, for example, being on time, but in general, they go unnoticed. Second point, they went through an evolution over time, but also, we will argue, a form of persistence. Third point, they are a kind of infrastructural network for timekeeping and time sharing, and this network is extremely useful for the functioning of the media themselves. Point number 4 that we will address, and it's generally unnoticed, time signals are content. They are a genre of media, and we will discuss more about it. Finally, of course, today we are going to discuss about time, and we think that time signals are super relevant in the history of keeping time. And this is what in the paper we call the current now. This is the paper that was recently published in the International Journal of Communication. It's in open access, so if you want to have a look, it's there. In the paper, we tried a kind of categorization or a typology of mediated time signals. We tried to have this categorization from the 19th century to today. So let's say from the telegraph to the internet, as we said in the subtitle. And we found at least 3 typology of mediated time signal. The first one, we call it scheduled time signals. The second one, on-demand time signals. The third one, automated time signals. I'm going to introduce the first one, and Maria will discuss more about the typology number 2 and number 3. As you can read here, the scheduled time signals are signals, time signals transmitted by institutions at regular time. They can be received regularly by a mass audience. Of course, the most relevant example, what we have in mind for sure, is the broadcasting time signals. But as was already said by John, also, for example, church bells, but also we can mention time balls in the past, and also cannon shots were all examples of scheduled time signals. What does it mean? It means that those time signals are, first of all, one too many. So there is a kind of institution sending the time signals to everybody. So it's a form of despatialized simultaneity, as I said at the beginning, but also a powerful ritual of synchronization. I think that also John used the word synchronization in Dickens' words. So it's quite interesting how this word, which is historical and we need to historicize it, I think it's a recurrent. Another important element of the so-called scheduled time signals is the fact that they are live events. If you miss the time signal, it's gone. If you miss the time signal on TV, you cannot reach it anymore. But it's not only TV, as I mentioned at the beginning. If you look at this kind of category of time signals, scheduled, you can find them at least starting from the early 19th century in the media. Especially in the early 19th century, telegraph offices used to synchronize their clocks to keep track of incoming and outgoing correspondence. So it was a kind of example, according to us, of what we call logistical media. So time signals were relevant for the functioning of the telegraph itself. Then, in the early 20th century, as you can read here, there was a kind of new medium called the circular telephone. The circular telephone is a new medium that appeared between the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century in several European and American cities. The thing is simple, so receiving regular transmissions, regular programs over the telephone lines instead of radio, or better, before the radio. And time signals at that time was one of the most relevant and most appreciated programs. Here you can see a schedule of the Italian Telephone Herald, that was its original name, in the 1920s. For who reads Italian, you can also have a look at the other programs, but I want to focus on 12 o'clock, when it's written, signaling of the noon given by the Royal Observatory of the Roman College, connected to the central station by a special wire, and then the ways in which the signal is given to the audience, we could say. Actually, it was this is a lie. because later the program announcer responsible for claiming it declared that she adopted an hands-on and, let's say, less precise practice. She simply listened to the cannon shot in Rome and then she broadcasted the signal. So this is funny on the one hand, and on the other, it's also an example, according to us, of the fact that there is a coexistence of old and new forms of time signals. In the early 20th century, wireless telegraphy changed again these time signals, scheduled time signals, and especially, and this is partially to answer what was written in the chat before, keeping time passed from being merely a regional or even city and national thing to an international and a global one. In 1912 was created a special international organization called the Bureau International de l'Heure, and it was created because of wireless telegraphy. At that time, in fact, it was built a kind of network of wireless telegraphy regulating the clock worldwide. So for the first time, people everywhere in the world could keep the time, the exact time, through wireless telegraphy. This is a kind of prehistory of time zones that are still relevant today. Then finally, a final example of scheduled time signals is what we said at the beginning, broadcasting, starting especially from the 1920s. The interesting thing is the fact that broadcasting inherited many formats and practices from circular telephone, from wireless telegraphy, and from telegraphy itself. And it became a kind of perfect content for early broadcasting. Of course, it's a matter of rhythm of the schedule, and still today it's quite relevant. Think about how obsessively radio speakers repeat the time in order to synchronize the audience. Here, I also would like to make you listen the famous BBC pipes. But I mean, it's not easy because maybe we can lose time. I can perform it for you, and it is 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. So 6 times a kind of tone, which reminds again telegraphy, and it's another interesting story. On Radio Moscow in the 1930s, the time signals were announced as follows, and I quote: "The signals of the exact time will be transmitted now. 2 long ones, 1 short. Citizens, check your watch." 2 long ones and 1 dot. Again, this is Morse code, let's say. Final form of remediation of time signals is more visual, and here you can see the picture, BBC News. So we have the television that added a visual dimension, not anymore just the audible dimension, and probably this is the most symbolic example. So the Big Bang and the time signals, which are again combined. Now I leave the floor to Maria for the next 2 typology, and here we are. Maria, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So let's continue with the second type of time signals. We identified it as on-demand time signal. So there were many attempts in the past 2 centuries to implement technical system to transmit a time signal by request. And the most significant experimentations actually concern the use of the telephone in its very traditional one-to-one form. So this media was the key to transmitting the time signal by request. And a very impressive role was taken by a switchboard operator in this process. So usually it required a very specific work, transmitting the time signal required a very specific work from their side. For example, sometimes switchboard operators would phone customers directly at their homes in a specific time of the day to wake them up. So basically they were working as an alarm clock. The customers could also actually call the operator to inquire about the exact time. And the practice became so popular that it contributed to congestion of the telephone lines in some countries. And actually, some telephone companies even had to prohibit their operators from providing the right time. So the perfect solution to the management of time signals on the telephone lines was found in the speaking clock. The invention of this medium, the speaking clock, was a very long and difficult process because there was a very specific mechanical issue. From the continuous rotation on the discs, the film would easily break. So it took quite a lot of time to actually implement the idea. So the first experiments with the automatic speaking clocks over the telephone lines were held in France in the 1930s, and similar services were later offered in many other countries starting from that point. So a crucial innovation of the speaking clock is its automatization in transmission. The time signal is reproduced on demand. So the customer calls a specific number and the pre-recorded voice announces the exact hour. Beams also persisted in this on-demand service, and you could see actually in this image on the left, the newspaper, the Indianapolis Star, depicts a dog in a telephone box that is instructed to hear the tone to know the exact time. I found it very peculiar, this people lining up to the telephone box occupied by a dog that is just calling the speaking clock. So the service became more and more relevant in the second half of the 20th century, and for a long time there was really no alternative to the speaking clock for getting a time signal by request. And the only choice that developed later in the 1980s was the teletext. So a teletext provides an on-demand time signals on TV, and it is a visual format now. Those were main forms of these on-demand time signals. And around the 1990s, this mechanical system of providing the tone was replaced with a digital system. And today we could use different websites to actually receive the exact time. So these various experiments with using telephone for transmitting these signals demonstrate the growing demand of subscribers to this on-demand time signal format. And at the same time, it also demonstrates the persistence of old and telegraphic format of time signals, such as tone, in this new media. So generally, this category of signal on-demand time signals set the road toward automation for the transmission of the time signal. So the third category of time signal is an automatized time signal. An automatized signal is something that is present in our digital media, whatever you are using now, a computer, a smartphone, all of these devices are receiving this automatized time signal. So any digital device actually have two clocks responsible for timekeeping, the hardware and the system clock, but the hardware clock is not that accurate in keeping the time. So the system clock needs to reset the time constantly and send a signal to the hardware to be able just to keep the correct time. So how the system is quite complicated. So just to give you a brief overview, the system clocks receives what is called the network time protocol time signal. And the network time protocol was designed in 1985, and it is one of the oldest protocols that lies in the foundation of the internet. So the time signal of the network time protocol has two main characteristics. First, it is fully automatic. So from the transmission to the reception, there is no human intervention at all. And secondary, it is mandatory both for users to receive and for media system to transmit. Otherwise, the system won't work at all. So it is the automatic reception and transmission also makes these time signals a necessity for the functioning of digital media systems. And the interesting thing is that the time signal is a Towns type, and that means that it is unique. So to illustrate this case, let us look at the next slide, which is this table. Yeah. So the first column here refers to the dates as we know, as we are used to write them. So can seem familiar. And then the fourth column, which is the NTP timestamp error offset. That's actually the number of seconds elapsed from a particular reference point. So right now the reference point is the 1st January 1900. You could see that basically each second is different, and each time signal, each timestamp would be unique. It's going to be that sequence of numbers, the number of seconds. So the same hour, minute, and second of different days have different timestamps, and the noon of today is a different time signal from the noon of tomorrow. Just as we scheduled and with on-demand time signals, they require a supplementary infrastructure to work properly. So this specific reference point. But in general, this whole system stresses out the relevance of intermediality because it's also
that one, Maria,
refers
sorry,
to
Maria,
different
for the interruption.
systems.
That's the right one. Sorry.
No, that before one, the one before was the right one.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, what I just wanted to say that the automatized time signal is indeed not only continuous, but it's also mandatory and inherently intermediate. So now let's proceed to the conclusions.
Okay.
Yeah. So to conclude, in our paper, we aimed at providing a historical overview of the role, relevance, and functioning of time in different media, such as electric telegraph, telephone, wireless telegraph, radio, television, broadcasting, and digital media. We propose 3 types of time signals that have emerged over the past 2 centuries: scheduled, on-demand, and automatized. They imply different relationships between media and time, so different rhythms of catching the time signal, different sense of liveliness, whether you can catch it right now or you can't, and a certain acceleration as well, because automatized time signal is transmitted continuously and basically each second, each millisecond. This paper has also provided 2 main theoretical perspectives, intermedia and intertechnological, looking at different time signals in different media, and also a longue durée one, because it looks at different mediated time signals over the past 2 centuries. And we'd like just to highlight changes and continuities that we could spot in our research. So there are mainly 2 important changes. The time signals has went through an evolution from a manual to an exclusively automatic service, communicated between machines without human interventions. And the time signals also become more and more invisible in the media ecology. So we don't know, as users of smartphones and computers, we don't know how these devices are receiving time signals. While in the beginning of 20th century, people would actually tune in the radio to just catch a time signal. So it would be very obvious practice. And there are also some continuities in this history of time signals. So first, there are different, there is a remediation of fault forms into new ones, such as beeps or tones that are continuously being remediated in these different forms of time signals. Then time signals remain an essential part in the existence and functioning of media systems, from the telegraph to the digital. Without communicating the time, these media systems cannot synchronize and cannot work properly together. And the third continuity is actually the coexistence of all the new formats. So these even though we are using still smartphones and computers, and we have all these automated time signals, we still hear the church bells ringing, and we still tune in to the radio, and we see time signals in the TV programs as well. Nowadays, media time signals are taken for granted and almost blended in our other media contexts, but we think that they are both important for the users and indispensable for the media to function. They are infrastructural media. So thank you a lot for your attention. Here is the time to move to the last slide.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Gabriele and Maria. Thanks a lot. We